What do you do when you lose your father to tragedy, your mother struggles with mental illness, and you and your siblings have to practically raise yourselves while taking care of your mother? Welcome to another episode of Life Jack, the Resilience Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rose. For this episode, we have an extraordinary guest who embodies the essence of resilience, Penny Marion. Penny is a devoted mother of two adults, a loving wife, and an avid cat lover. Her journey has taken her from a career in respiratory therapy to an executive role in disability insurance. And now she's a career coach dedicated to helping individuals who have faced challenges in maintaining employment. Penny's life has not been without its own set of challenges. She lost her father at a young age, navigated a complex relationship with her mentally ill mother, and grew up in poverty. Despite these hardships, she turned to education and her passion for reading to forge a better life for herself and her family. After being diagnosed with complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, Penny made healing her full-time job, leading to the creation of her coaching business, where she shares her insights and experiences to empower others. On this episode, she'll share her story of resilience, the importance of education, and the transformative power of post-traumatic growth. Let's dive into this inspiring conversation with Penny Marion.
Sometimes life gives us lemons. Sometimes it gives us lemonade. Other times it gives us something entirely out of left field that makes us say, WTF. But no matter what obstacles come, there is most often a way out on the other side, and we are once again victorious. My name is Dr. Rose, and you are listening to my podcast about resilience. Every guest shares a tragedy to triumph story to give listeners like you the inspiration to push through every single day. Listen now as my next guest shares how they were life-jacked.
Hi, Penny. Welcome. Thank you so much for being a guest on my show. How are you?
I'm very well today, thank you. And I am extremely excited to be your guest and to get to share parts of my story to help other people.
So can you share a bit more about your background and how your early experiences possibly shaped your views on resilience?
Sure. So for me, for many, many years, other people told me I was resilient, and the other word they like to use was tenacious. And I believed I was. But I didn't feel resilient, and I think there's a really big difference between the two because I had normalized a lot of my experiences, and I think that that was definitely a barrier for me. And so I had to really accept that my life was different from many other people before I could actually feel resilient. So for me, it was a very slow evolutionary process before I got there because, as you had said, I lost my father when I was just 9 years old. And, I kind of assigned all of my trauma to that because it was what they call that big T, big trauma. And I hadn't really acknowledged the challenges that I faced throughout the rest of my life, largely in my relationship with my mother. So it was kind of hard to feel resilient when you didn't necessarily accept that there was something broken. And so, I believed what other people told me. I just didn't necessarily feel it until I really got into some good therapy and really learned more about what the word meant to assign how it should feel. Because I also really had dissociated a lot and didn't let myself feel many things, including resilience. So for me, that was a really big difference. Knowing I was, believing I was, and then actually feeling that way was a very long process.
So it's interesting that you mentioned losing your father at such a young age. While 9, I couldn't even imagine. And I know that had to have been incredibly difficult because I'm sure you had so many questions. So many wondering. So within that, how did you cope with that loss? And of course, How did it affect your childhood?
Losing my father was definitely one of the most defining moments of my life. And it's one that never really goes away, that feeling of father loss, because throughout life, you're always going to interact with other people who had a father and had a relationship with them and got to experience a lot of the things that I didn't. For me, one of the things that I did was I was able to find a few stable adults throughout my life, and I kind of clung to them as long as I could until my third grade teacher was there. I had just started fourth grade when my father died, but she was there for me. I clung to her as long as I could. And many years later, I found her to thank her, and we've maintained a friendship. I clung to the pastor at church and really clung to, my Uncle Pete, who was my great uncle. And so for me, I looked for adult role models that I could try to replace pieces of what a father relationship would be. I was lucky that I did find a few, but I knew that none of them were ever really a permanent relationship or were something that could truly replace having a father. So, whenever there were things at school, making things for Father's Day, it was always awkward as a kid. I made things for my brother, who was 6 years older than me. And in all honesty, he was the man of the house. So, that he kind of took on that kind of a role, but he was not that much older than me. And so coping with it, it's one of those things that it hits you at these times when you're not quite prepared. You be at a wedding and somebody has a father-daughter dance and you realize I'm never going to have one of those. Father's Day, until I had my own kids and they had a father to experience it with, was always very difficult. It still is, to see other people do it. But I also have learned to look at it from a different perspective and say, it's great that other people get to experience things I didn't. And I've been lucky in other parts of my life. And so I try to remind myself of that as much as possible. But it was really hard. I was so young. I think the biggest challenge for me was, I was barely 9 years old. And it was back in the day when you watch TV all the time and you get sucked into whatever was going on TV. And nobody really dies on television. They're all like doing some government mission and they'll come back someday. So they're not really gone. And I think it was very easy for me as such a young and naive child to tell myself that kind of a story. But I also knew not to say it out loud because I knew it probably wasn't very realistic, but it was a good way for me to avoid grief and to avoid accepting that I didn't have a father. So, it's something that took me many years to try to work around. I don't think it'll ever get easier, but it's something that I at least had him for 9 years. And there were a lot of kids who didn't have a father in their life from day one for many different reasons. And I was lucky I had him as long as I did.
Well, I'm certainly glad to hear that you did have some stable adults that were able to step in or be fill-in, if you will, throughout your life. Because yes, I could imagine, whether you lost your father to death or you grew up without knowing who your father is, and either one of them are hard because there's still this void or there's this hole that you have, right? Because there's another parent that you do not necessarily get to know. And so now with the father that you lost, and so you did have a remaining parent, but you mentioned, as I was researching the episode and looking, into, your career and the things that you shared with me, and you mentioned that you had a complex relationship with your mother. So on the flip side, thank you for, the feelings that you experienced with not having a father, but then even though your mother was present, but she really wasn't present. So how did that experience influence, your understanding of trauma and the impact on mental health?
Yeah, I think at a very young age, I knew what mental health was because I used to read, and I know we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I remember trying to get my mother in the older group called Displaced Homemakers for people who were, mothers on their own and didn't have a spouse. She fought that one and never went. But I knew that there was something off with my mom, but I didn't know that other people didn't have the same experience. we had a very small community that was our family, and we didn't really get a lot of time outside of that small neighborhood. And so I knew that my mother, she had had a really rough life and she hadn't done the work to move forward. And I didn't realize until even recently that, my father had really been taking care of my mother. And when my father passed away, that's really why my siblings and I kind of picked up those behaviors and the responsibilities. And, to other people, my mother may have appeared fine, but she couldn't drive. She, at that time, didn't have, an education. She did get her high school GED, so I was very proud of her for that. But being a victim, she had been a victim for so much of her life that it became her identity. And, for me, I knew I did not want to be a victim, so I fought back and didn't accept my circumstances. So I tried to take the complete opposite course that my mother had taken. And it's not easy, being a young kid and having to tend to your mother's needs emotionally, socially, sometimes physically. My mother had been chronically sick. She was going to die every year, for about 40 years. And so it was one of those things where you were always on edge. But again, she was a victim. She was very dramatic. And a lot of it was rooted in her own trauma. And fortunately, as part of my recovery, I went to a retreat in England with the wonderful Dr. Peter Levine, and intergenerational trauma was something that was talked about. And it was very eye-opening for me to realize, some of these traumas had been going through multiple generations and impacted all of us in different ways, but it kind of accumulates and somebody has to break the cycle. And I feel very lucky that I'm the one that chose to break the cycle. And my daughter is choosing to do the same thing. So, I feel like between the two of us, we're really going to rock the boat a little bit and make it better. But when you have, generation after generation, it's very hard.
I can imagine a lot of guests that I have come on the show and they talk about intergenerational trauma, and it's so real. It's good that we have resources. Like you said, you went over to London and you were able to go to a retreat for mental health, because a lot of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents just didn't realize that there were resources available. I mean, if you look back in history, there were some really traumatic times that were going on in the United States. Not that we haven't had traumatic times, now, but I don't think they were as right. There wasn't as much oppression going on against certain groups. Now I think it's a little bit more overt, but no, most definitely. So I have to congratulate you on breaking the cycle, you and your daughter, because I know it's incredibly difficult. And, kudos to you. And although, like you said, your mother just, finished with a GED, but you have been able to have a successful career in various fields. You were a respiratory therapist, and then, of course, now you had a role in an executive position in disability insurance, and now you transitioned to be a career coach. So what motivated you to, take that leap of faith and go out on your own to be a career coach, but not just any career coach, this is the part about you that I love as I was doing the research, was that you're a career coach focused on trauma recovery. So what brought that about?
Yeah. For me, honestly, my mother died. I, was in my VP role. She died during the pandemic. I hadn't been able to see her for a couple of years. I did okay, I think, for a year, and then something just kind of broke. And I used my benefits at work. I stepped away from work and took leave of absence and a disability leave. And when I was out, and that's when I got diagnosed with the complex PTSD. It's funny because I'd seen the therapist for several years, and she said, well, I've known since day one that you had this. And it was like, what do you mean? But she knew I wasn't ready for that, to have that, that diagnosis and to start the work. And when my mom had been gone, all of a sudden things started to spiral, and I realized I can't avoid this work. I have to do it. And so while I was on my leave, I live in a pretty, rural area, and there aren't a lot of, resources for that are trauma trained. I was lucky to have a trauma trained therapist, but I I went to my first retreat, and while I was there, I realized that I was very privileged to have a therapist, let alone a trauma-trained therapist, because there were 80 of us in the room, and I was shocked how many were in there at a retreat because they couldn't get into a therapist. They'd been waiting for a long time. And I had made my healing and recovery my full-time job while I had the protection of my employee benefits. And so for me, it was a matter of, I reached a point where I said, I'm probably not going to be able to go back to doing what I was doing. It was just too high pressure, too many hours. I hadn't taken care of my mental health or physical health. And so I, started thinking about, well, what am I good at? And I had read online about Ikigai, the Japanese philosophy, where you explore your purpose by asking yourself, 4 key questions. What do I love? What am I good at? What does the world need? And what can I make the world pay for so I can actually have a paycheck? And so I went through that exercise to kind of explore. And through that, I came up with, I love career coaching. I loved coaching people within my organization for career transitions. And so I got to do that quite a bit in my, career. And so I thought I want to do that. So I actually did a online training class to become a certified executive coach and mentor. While I was at the retreat and I saw those people and I felt so privileged, I went, oh, wait a minute. These people, a lot of them lost their job. They don't even have health insurance. So their wait to get a therapist is going to be a lot longer. And so I thought, what do I know that could help other people? And I know a lot about insurance and benefits and job protection. And so I thought, well, if I could do career coaching to help people with trauma not quit their jobs impulsively or manage their behavior so they don't get fired, because that's a real challenge when you have deeply rooted trauma and you're not even aware of the trauma and the behaviors. It's very hard to maintain employment. And so I thought if I could find a way to help them stay working, they would be able to keep their benefit and have the tools they need to be able to recover and get better and get their lives back. And so for me, I kind of made that into my purpose, that I already know I can career coach. I know there's a need for career coaching. I know that, I don't charge very much for my services because frankly, I have a paying job where I work a few hours a week with executives. I want to work with the average person who, turns through a job every year because they can't maintain employment because of their trauma. So I want to make my services readily available. And so I work with my clients, teaching them about how has trauma impacted your overall wellness as it pertains to work. So we look at, the 8 dimensions of wellness, all of them from a trauma and an employment perspective. And so for me, that was something that nobody else out there was doing. So I pulled out all my resources and put together a program that's a 10-week program based on that premise. You look at your Ikigai. What's my purpose? Each week we do a dimension of wellness. You journal about it all week, and then we just talk about what did you discover. I ask questions, and then we do the Ikigai again at the end and say, okay, is your purpose more clear? Is it totally different? Sometimes it's the same. It varies from one person to the next. But the goal is that the career coaching I do for trauma survivors is going to help them to maybe get better focus so that they can maintain that employment, maintain their benefits, and have their own path to recovery.
One of the hardest things for people to recognize is that whatever they're dealing with when they are feeling overwhelmed or extremely stressed or they're panicking or having an anxiety attack and they don't even realize why, sometimes it has to do with childhood trauma or things that you experienced as a child because your mind doesn't know the difference.
Yeah.
That is not what you're experiencing right now. And even the slightest thing can remind you of something else. And sometimes you don't even know what it is. And so I love that you're focused on helping people who, they're going through job after job after job after job, and they don't realize they think, they allow people to tell them, oh, you're a problem and, you're difficult to get along with and you're all of these things, negative things, right? Rather than trying to get to the root source of the behavior, right? Because really that's what it is. It's just the behavior. And maybe
it really is. And it's interesting because I have a friend that I worked with in insurance and she's now a therapist. And what's funny is when I had been out of, my executive role for, I don't know, maybe 9 months, I had lunch with her and we were talking about, did I want to pursue this opportunity, and start my own business doing this? And she put it to me perfectly. She's like, Penny, you've always chased the money. She's like, all you were about was move up the ladder, make more money, because I didn't have money growing up. And, when I was talking to her, I all of a sudden realized that that's what a lot of us with trauma do is we get one thing in our head and we're chasing it, whether it be money, job title, something specific about one goal. We become so fixated that we don't always step back and see patterns that occur. So as I started journaling, one of the things that became very apparent for me when I was working with my trauma therapist was I'm like, wow, I see a pattern in my employment. Every time I would have a boss that I actually could trust and formed a good relationship, when an organizational change would come along and I would have something going on in my personal life, divorce, something, I would lose my manager and I would get reassigned to somebody that I didn't know, I didn't trust. And I would be like, I have to get out of Dodge, get out of here. I can't do this. And I would find a new job. And in hindsight, I found that happen 3 times in my career. But in the throes of the moment, I had no idea that there was any sort of a pattern. And so for me, when I'm working with clients, that's what I want them to identify, to look back and say, I do see a pattern of when these situations come up, I go into survival mode and I use that reptilian brain. And I think that is where it's very hard for people because, if you don't have a trauma trained therapist, it's hard to figure out how deep do you need to go. And for someone with complex trauma, it's very often rooted in childhood. And it's something that is incredibly deep and buried away in them. And they, may acknowledge part of it like I did and may not acknowledge the rest. And it's hard to see a pattern when you're still stuck in the trauma cycle.
Now, I can be diagnosed with complex PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. You've mentioned that it took you some time to acknowledge the extent of your trauma. And so now you're an entrepreneur, business owner, which is incredibly difficult, as you and I both know. But moving forward, what has this journey been like for you after having to acknowledge the extent of your trauma and now having to navigate this, career path of being your own boss and having to do everything yourself?
Yeah. Well, I had been in therapy for many years, not with a trauma trained therapist. When I moved from Maine to Iowa, I fell into great practice that only had one, therapist. And lucky for me, she was trauma trained. When she saw that she had done medical records and I was giving the medical records to my disability insurance company and I saw the diagnosis of complex PTSD. Fortunately, I had an appointment with her in a few minutes and I have to admit that was one of the most painful moments for me. I cried like a baby and I don't usually let myself cry for myself. And so it was a big moment. But once I accepted that and started working on it, I knew that I needed to have a different set of goals. I didn't have to I couldn't chase the money anymore. I had to do something that was going to give me a better balance to take care of my physical and mental health. So for me, while I know that there are a lot of juggling responsibilities of being a small business owner, I also have the luxury of saying, okay, I know I need to decompress after I see a client. So I'm not booking my clients back to back. I can take a few minutes, go sit on the porch, have something to drink and kind of do a reset. I can do some of my mindfulness-based relaxation exercises at my desk in between. So I have control by working for myself over a lot of parts of my life that are going to make me healthier than I did when I was booked in 4 meetings all at the same time and always back to back for a 10-hour day in corporate America. So for me, the biggest step, I think, was I had to reset financially. What do I really need? Because I didn't even acknowledge that we were poor until, a good year after my mother died. My sister and I were having a conversation, and I'm like, I can't believe, my therapist told me we grew up poor. And my sister's like, what are you talking about? You didn't know that? And I guess I was just in denial. But when I went home the next time and I drove by my childhood home, it struck me. We were, I remember, I honestly broke into somebody's house for lunch many times just to be able to have lunch. I remember, when we went from bell-bottom pants to straight-leg pants being in style, all I could get was bell-bottom ones, and I learned how to sew them to make them look like they were straight-legged, or buy maternity clothes and make them into regular clothes because we just didn't have the money. But I still didn't want to acknowledge that. And so I think for me, part of the journey career-wise aligned with accepting parts of the journey I had throughout my life that I had denied. And I think I realized I don't need as much as I thought I needed. And it was because I was just always so afraid of losing everything because I'd lost my father so young that I was always waiting for everything to just be gone.
I love that you said you give yourself grace, that you're intentional. One of the things that I had to learn from in my previous podcast, Strive for More, and this podcast is to give myself intentional breaks where I have to take breaks and not interview people for a couple of weeks. One, because of the nature of the topic of the podcast, because it's resilience and it's trauma, right? And so I have to make sure that I take on all of those things, right? And have that balance from, and I don't take on, the trauma from other people, especially me being an empath. But
I can relate.
Yes, absolutely. And so that is true. And good for you. And to those of you out there, listeners, if you are in a service industry based job, or, even just as a career on your own, as an entrepreneur in your own business, you have to take breaks. What Penny is saying is absolutely true. You actually gain more clients, believe it or not, when you put yourself take a break, because then you're able to, right? Don't you agree, Penny? You're able to reset
completely.
Yes, most definitely. Now, can you talk about the role that education and reading played a part in your life? I think, as you said, as a means of escape and empowerment.
Yeah. It's funny. I have always loved to read. And my sister and I and my brother, we all did. That's one of the most positive, wonderful things we got from my mother. And so we taught our kids a love of reading as well. And I remember being little, and I literally read. One of my mother's most prized possessions was we had the old World Book Encyclopedia set. I actually remember reading the entire thing. I remember in the 70s, we had a bomb scare at school, and I had brought B with me. And I ran into the school after the bomb threat and got in big trouble because I'd left B in the room, and I thought the school was going to blow up and we'd have everything in the World Book except for the letter B, and I was terrified. But the library for me was a convenient place to go because my mom took care of my cousin's children, and my cousin worked at the State House, which was walking distance. And at the State House, they had a library next door, the State Library. And so I would go there out of convenience, knowing that she could give me a ride home when she would go pick up her kids at my mom's house. And so I would get lost in reference books. We're talking back in the day when I even wanted to learn about my father's death because nobody really talked about him. And so I would go in and I would find the microfiche articles about his death and read them. So that, is there something that somebody wasn't telling me? So, it was like old school, hardcore library. And for me, it was a chance to really explore what else the world had to offer. And I still tend to migrate more towards nonfiction than fiction, although I have a book club and I told my daughter I'm going to focus on getting more fiction in my reading this year just because everything I read is pretty heavy. But it's just been something that for me, knowledge is empowerment. And, if I wanted to have a different life, I had to know what my options were. I had to know what was out there. And what better way to get that information than to read it? Now, today you have a lot of different tools available, but some of them aren't reliable, as far as accuracy. But for me, being a kid, I could, just dive into, a book and learn about some different career or, part of history. And it could just take me away and help me to see what other path life could offer me. And so I really was able to use that as my launching pad for saying, if I'm going to get out of here and have a different life, I have to know what my options are. And ironically enough, my first college degree was in respiratory therapy, as you said. I literally picked it out of a phone book and thought, well, if I don't like it, I can change majors. And most kids today don't even know what a phone book is. But it ended up being a wonderful career for me. And it was the start of me branching out. I moved across the bridge from my mother's house. Then I moved to the next town over. Then I moved a whole hour away. And then here I am now, 1,500 miles from where I originally, grew up. And so for me, reading and learning about what else was out there not only sparked my imagination, but it gave me hope. And it gave me ideas on what I could make of my life if I didn't want to be a victim.
And you've mentioned therapy several times, and I love that. And I want to make sure that people understand, therapy is wonderful. And so we can't mention, go to therapy, go to therapy, go to therapy. We can't mention it enough. It's so, one, eye-opening, and two, healing. And it does really help you go forward. But I know it's been a crucial part of your healing process. So how did and you mentioned that you had a trauma-trained therapist. And so sometimes people don't even know that there's a difference. But how did finding a trauma-trained therapist change your outlook on your recovery?
Well, it was interesting because I started with a therapist she was a social worker. She was absolutely wonderful. I was with her for 15 years. And in all honesty, we never talked about trauma. We talked about my relationship with my mom, but not the deep-rooted stuff. Then she retired, and I got a therapist that I was with for probably 9 months before I moved, who was trauma-trained, and she tried to do the EMDR to help me reprocess. Didn't work. I wasn't ready. Then I moved halfway across the country, and it was luck that I ended up finding my current therapist. But the difference really was it was so remarkable because it wasn't just talk therapy. We actually were doing a lot of work delving into what really caused this, what physically changed in my brain as a result of different experiences. What did that do to my behaviors and my thought process going forward? And so for me, I was very lucky. The 3 therapists I saw, I liked them all. I know some people, the first few they try aren't a good fit. And that's okay too. You got to find the right fit. I was just very, very fortunate. But having someone who was trauma trained, especially for me being someone who is very cerebral and into learning and that knowledge of and understanding of things, it was really good for me to have someone who could help me to take what had happened, see physically what happened to my brain as I went through all of that at such a young age, and then to translate that into how it impacted my relationships and my behaviors throughout my life. And so, different therapists practice different ways. I will say when I first went out of work, I saw my therapist twice a week, and it was pretty intense. We got to a point where I had been doing the EMDR for those who don't know it, that eye movement desensitization, and it helps you to reprocess memories. And so I had done that for a while and we were making progress. And I love the fact that my therapist, who I am very attached to, said, you need to do this other type of work. And I'm not really strong in that. I'd like you to see a different therapist for that. So I backed off to once a week with my primary therapist and saw a second trauma therapist working on those ego states and the parts of me. And so for me, I was seeing two therapists once a week for quite a while, and I'm now just slowly getting down to once a week and transitioning. But, I was lucky with my first therapist. I'm still sad. We had a hospital merger. She took a different job, but she works with veterans with PTSD now. And I'm so happy for where she is. I see her on weekends and I'm very, very lucky for that. But it was really important to me that I had someone who could help me to understand this wasn't all in my mind because, it's actually rooted in your brain. And I think that, when you're talking mental health, I actually prefer the term brain health now because I think that it helps people to see it's not something you're imagining. When you think of your mind, you think imaginary friends, you imagine things. Yet when you think about your brain, you think it's more scientific based. And when you're looking at our mental health and trauma, especially, there are changes in the brain. And I think it's important that when someone has those experiences, they can work with a therapist who can help them truly understand that because it takes it from something that's more subjective to something that is more objective. And I think that that is really important, especially as we live in a world with a lot of stigma. And, I will probably go to therapy for my entire life and I absolutely love it. I view it as my paid best friend and it's been great for me. I encourage my kids to do it as part of their regular health care because I just don't think you can underestimate the value of your brain health and taking care of yourself from that perspective as well. So it really has changed a ton of my overall life, my outlook, my recovery, and even my role as a parent and how I raise my kids.
What do you believe are the best strategies for building resilience, particularly for those who have experienced trauma?
Yep. The first one took me forever to do, but I would say journal. Even when you don't think you have anything to write about, journaling is a great reflective activity to reflect on what has happened in your life, whether it be day to day or it triggers something more deep rooted. It can be a good way to delve into how you respond to things, how things make you feel when you're not necessarily comfortable vocalizing. Sometimes it's easier to write how you feel, but also when you look back through it, it can help you to see patterns in your life. And sometimes that can bring about epiphanies for you. Second advice is don't accept your circumstances, but use them to your advantage whenever possible to pave the way for a brighter future. I could have stayed where I was and just had another generation of the same patterns occurring over and over again. But I took my circumstances, I learned from them, and I used them in how I work with my clients so that other people can see they're not alone. My experiences can validate what other people are going through. And sometimes you think you're the only one, but having somebody share their story can really make a big difference. And it doesn't mean that you have to be a trauma coach or a therapist to do that. Sometimes just knowing that a friend has been through something similar can help you to start your own healing process. And then get a good team of healthcare providers who are willing to advocate for you. To me, that is so critical. People tend to, go in only when they have a problem. Go in for your regular physicals. Get into therapy if you need it before things get so desperate that you need it urgently, and be more proactive about your health care. Because I think that, mental health, brain health is just as important as our physical health. And I think those three approaches, journaling, using your past as a catalyst to move forward and making sure that you maintain good health are all going to be really good things that will help trauma survivors move forward in life.
Now, finally, what advice would you give to someone who is currently struggling to maintain employment while dealing with their trauma?
Don't quit your job. Explore your benefits. Work with your healthcare providers to take time away from work without severing ties with your employer. If you explode at work and you walk out, you get fired, you quit, you lose access to job protected leave, to disability benefit, and things that can really save you and allow you to focus on your healing without worrying about finances. And so for me, the big thing is understand what you have for benefits before you need them. And whatever you do, don't just quit your job when you're having, a crisis, because seeking medical care, getting an out of work note, going for disability and a leave of absence can really be a huge asset in your recovery. And I just hate to see people who quit and then they come to me to talk about their benefits and it's like you're no longer eligible because you're no longer working.
Wow. I know one of the biggest pieces of advice that my parents gave me when I first started working over 20 years ago in the field of education was to get short-term disability benefits.
Yeah.
Like that was.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because for me, I lived with life insurance. My father didn't have, he has like $1,000 life insurance policy and that was it. And he was the only one in my family that worked. My mother didn't work. And so, it was one of those things where, fortunately we had Social Security and they helped us, until I reached 18 years of age. But, to me, it's disability coverage and life insurance coverage. Make sure you have enough life insurance coverage to cover your debt and for the people you love most to take a little time off from work to deal with losing you. And so, for me, that was a really important one. And I lost my brother when he was 46. And, fortunately, he had gotten ample life insurance, but it's hard for us to have learned that by losing our father.
No, absolutely. Well, Penny, thank you so much for sharing your powerful story and insights with us today. Your journey of resilience and transformation is truly inspiring, and it's incredible to see how you turn your experiences into a source of strength for yourself and others. For our listeners who want to learn more about your work or connect with you, how can they find you?
My website is resiliencecareercoaching.com. And if they want to email me directly, it's Penny at Resilience Career Coaching. And it's Penny, Penny. I don't have an E in there. Penny, just like the coin. But if they look me up online, they'll be able to find me pretty easily. And I'd be happy to talk to any of the listeners and answer any questions they may have.
Any last words of encouragement for the listeners?
I think one of my big ones is don't be ashamed of what has happened to you in the past. And, I think that we naturally assign a lot of shame and we avoid vulnerability. And, without vulnerability and accepting what's happened to us, we're not going to get better. So if anybody, is struggling with that, my favorite book, is The Gifts of Imperfection by Brene Brown. That's one of my two favorite books. But I would say never feel ashamed of what has happened to you. You can move forward and make a life for yourself, regardless of what your circumstances have been.
Thank you again for joining us on Life Back to the Resilience podcast. And I wish you all the best in your continued journey of healing and helping others.
Thank you.
Be sure to join us next time for more uplifting stories and insights on resilience. Until then, keep pushing forward, embrace the journey, and remember that every setback can lead to a greater comeback. Dr. Rowe signing off.
You have just listened to Life Jacked, the Resilience podcast with your host, Dr. Rowe. Subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, and any other podcast streaming platform. Remember to live, laugh, love, learn, and then repeat. See you in the next episode.